Hi Deepa. Good to have you here. And I think these conversations are curated specifically keeping gender in mind. So that's the focus. And I'm so glad that you've agreed to be part of them. I think it's very, very important for us as feminists looking at science and to build conversations between women in science and the practitioners of science and what we do, and to see if there are any common grounds that we can arrive at, that we can work with. So the first question, Deepa, is that we've had to challenge this whole idea of the value neutrality of science, scientific institutions, scientific cultures, because empirically what we see is that there is only a certain kind of group of people who get to do, for example, science, right? You see women, much lesser women. You see women are there, but then they don't get represented. There is the glass ceiling, the asbestos ceiling, the leaky pipeline. All these terms have come out only to indicate that women are not there present enough, along with many other groups, marginal groups. So this idea of value neutrality of science actually is something that we deeply question. And I just wanted you to respond to that. How do you look at it? What has been your experience? What have been your thoughts and reflections?
So my own experience personally has been that I think this idea of is science neutral or does it have neutral values is a difficult one, because I feel like science is an enormous human endeavor.
Yes.
And there are so many aspects to it.
Of course.
In general, I feel most things that humans do tend to be biased in some shape or form, because of the conditions we find ourselves in, because of our peculiar circumstances, our own experiences, and so on. So in some sense, I feel like therefore, as a human endeavor, as a collective human endeavor, science is not neutral entirely. But there are some aspects of science or doing science that I think are more neutral and some that are less neutral.
Of course.
I feel that like the way at least that I have approached it has been the scientific questioning has been free of gender or gendered, I guess, loaded things or biased approaches. The way I have observed it being done as a broad brushstroke in my own field of biology has been fairly free of gendered ideas or constructions. But I will say that again, because we're humans and we're operating as humans, there are biases that come in how we ask questions sometimes, which questions we ask, which model organisms we choose to study, which sex we choose to study in our model organisms.
Of course.
And this is well documented in things like, for example, many of the questions that have been asked to look at about anatomy, about disease, about progression of development and so on have been addressed in males, male mice, male other rodents, male whatever, study subjects, much more than women have, and this is very well documented at this point and much discussed. So I feel like I don't have anything unique to say about that really. In my own field, in evolutionary biology, there has been debate about and closely allied fields like anthropology or even archaeology, how the data that are generated or there are the observations that are generated, how they are interpreted, has been influenced by the gender of the scientist, by the gender of the bigger group of scientists with whom discussions are going to happen about the findings and so on. And famously, this is known in the case of things like sociobiology, about human evolution, about the evolution of human societies, through hunter-gatherer times, through and up to now, and also in the context of sexual selection and how that operates and how that shapes organisms and the sexes differently in a vast array of animals and plants and so on. That has been certainly influenced by gender ideas. In my own field, especially what I do now, I don't study sexual selection. I study primarily natural selection, and I study primarily a lot of molecular evolution.
Okay.
Where I think just because of the nature of the questions being asked, I feel there's a less of a bias
Probability
in
of the
terms of
bias.
gender. Yeah. But that's not to say there aren't biases. There are other kinds of biases that come
Like
up.
what?
So for example, one of the things I study now, I focus on much more now, is the role of mutations in driving evolutionary change. And for quite some time, for several decades in fact, since sort of the structure of DNA and how genes function, what genes are and so on was unraveled, more than 50 years ago now. It has been this idea in evolutionary biology that selection is the primary determinant of what is the fate of genetic variance in populations.
Right.
And selection is the primary shaper of the outcomes of evolution, with mutation thought to play a relatively smaller role simply because it is the mutation generates variation, but then the fate of those mutations is determined primarily by selection. And that's true. But increasingly it's clear in the last few decades, as we have more and more power and both statistical and analytical power to understand the effects of mutations and the variation that's generated in terms of the type of mutation, it's becoming clear that actually what kind of mutations occur and which type of mutations are more likely to occur can also significantly shape evolutionary dynamics. And this is something that has come up partly because we now have the tools to do it, which we lacked before, but also because of the assumptions that were being made at that point of time to simplify thinking, to have models, mathematical models be tractable, and for other reasons. And so, the role of mutations was relegated to saying, okay, you're supplying variation at some rate, and that's the role that was primarily considered. That's now changing. Right? Another dogma that has been around for quite some time was the idea that a certain kind of mutations which don't alter the amino acid sequence in our DNA were thought to be primarily not important for selection because they don't change the amino acid. And so these mutations are called synonymous changes, as the name suggests. So they are these are mutations that change between synonyms, right? So of the 20 amino acids that our DNA encodes for, many of them are actually coded for in our actual DNA sequence by several triplets, codons as they're called. And so if you move from codon A to B and they both tell the cellular machinery to put in the same amino acid there, then it should not matter for selection, correct? But again, in the last few decades, it has become very obvious that actually that's not true. So the very basic information that's encoded in DNA has to do with which codon is there and which amino acid is there. But over evolutionary time, many layers of other kinds of information have also been added to what our DNA carries. And so now our DNA, any piece of DNA that you take from any organism, doesn't just have the blueprint for what the sequence of a particular protein is going to be.
Yeah.
It also has often regulatory information. It has information about how this molecule is going to fold, how the DNA is going to fold, how the RNA is going to fold, how the protein is going to fold, where is it going to be localized in the cell, how much of it is going to be produced, when is it going to be stopped, when the production is going to stop, and so on. And so all of these are also encoded in the same string of bases that our DNA is composed of, which means that when you make changes to this DNA, even though they may not change the amino acids, they can change these other bits of information. So this is again an assumption that was there in our field for a long time. Not just my field, as in not just evolutionary biology, this was a core assumption in genetics. And genetics now pervades all of biology.
All of them. Yeah.
But in the last, I would say, 2 to 3 decades, it is very clear that across all kinds of model organisms, all kinds of genes, non-coding DNA also, these kinds of mutations can be really important. And so there are these, I don't want to call them biases really, because they're really part of the scientific process, that you start with a set of assumptions that help you approach a problem in a way that's tractable. Because if we start off with the idea that all mutations may have an impact on an organism's phenotype or fitness, then we don't, it's much harder to work with. Right? You have a very large set of mutations to work with.
Yeah. So what you're saying is bias, quote unquote. I don't use that word very much, but it can come in because sometimes it's not practical to ask all questions at one point in time, and you start asking them as you go along. And what are the other factors that play into moving, say, from one set of assumptions to another set of assumptions?
I mean, sometimes you happen to be lucky to observe an organism in which the breaking down of those held assumptions, previously held assumptions, is much more obvious, right? So if you are studying a strange organism in a strange environment, you might be able to, your observations may more easily go against, you know, the conform, sort of the assumptions that are in the field. So maybe that's one way that you stumble into something that is different.
Yeah. And observations, would you say, are guided by theoretical positions and presumptions?
Usually, I would say many, at least the way I think a lot of science happens now. That's not to say that, you know, there's not an important role for the kind of science that involves more exploring, just observing something because it's not understood, and then asking, just noting down. So this is, I guess, what we would call natural history. And natural history is not necessarily happening only in the field. It can also happen under a microscope in a laboratory, or, you know, in your home if you are observing something. So Mendel famously did experiments in his garden of the monastery where he worked. And that has been the case in many other aspects of biology as well, where people were observing something wherever they were, in whatever profession or hobby situation they were in, and they made observations which were important later on to make sense of something, to add to the diversity that we understand about biology, to be a core feature of biology. So hypotheses and theories have a role in science, a very important one, but I think it is also supremely important that this kind of more free-flowing and open-ended, careful observation of what
material,
is happening, of what is there, what is living, how is it reproducing, how is it surviving, has played an extremely important role. And I think it still does. You know, so a few years ago, people discovered these giant viruses. The thinking was viruses are super tiny, but now we know that there are viruses which are, you know, as big as bacteria. We know that there are some bacteria which are much bigger than, you know, what we think of as super tiny organisms. And so really it's astonishing. The more we, you know, keep discovering, all boundaries that we place in biology keep getting broken down, keep getting expanded.
That's wonderful. That's true of all creative activity. As you said, human beings undertake. And so I wish I were a feminist biologist and I could engage with a technical discussion with you on this, but I am a sociologist, so I will let that task, leave that task to somebody else. The other thing we observe as feminists is that there is a hierarchy of the disciplines, which everybody observes, right? There is physics considered to be much more harder, abstract, formal, in our language, more masculinized discipline, and biology is considered to be softer, more subjective, dealing less with very exact reductive analyses, and it is often seen as a science which is feminized. There's another layer of the feminization that happens, we argue, is that because it deals with nature, quote unquote, women tend to be naturally either pushed into it or attracted to biology, so you see a lot more women in biology than you do in physics. How do you look at this kind of feminization? This happens to us in the social sciences. My discipline, for example, sociology, is seen as a much more feminized one, and so is anthropology, as opposed to, say, economics or psychology. So we, of course, within the social science silo, as feminists, would argue that this gendering of the disciplines is as much a problem as any other question, like low representation of women in science. How do you look at this between physics and biology, for instance?
I think what you say is certainly true, that gendering exists. I think at the career stage that I'm at, it doesn't affect me so much directly for my functioning. I suspect it plays a much bigger role in our society, because as children, when you're a female child or a male child, you may be guided much more into one direction or the other if you have an inclination and an interest in pursuing science. I'm certain this happens in our society globally as well at that early stage, right? But I think as you go, as you start specializing and as you choose a path and you start going there, you stop meeting the other sciences and other scientists as much. And so I feel like,
especially in a place like
the NCBS, for example, I just but not just there as well. I think where the institution is dedicated to the study of biology. So there's no question about are you better than physicists or less than or whatever. it simply doesn't arise. It simply doesn't occur, right?
Yeah.
But I do think it plays an important role at an earlier stage where people are making their choices and thinking about their careers. There I suspect it does matter. And there I think it is important to break down those ideas of what is better or what is worse, and say, choose what you are interested in doing.
Yeah, so this idea of better and worse also reflects for us a deeper gendering of knowledge itself, Why is it that certain kind of knowledge is considered to be superior and other kind of knowledge is not considered to be superior? So for example, and who gets to do that superior knowledge?
Yeah.
So for instance, in sociology, in sociological theory has always been considered to be the domain of men, and women in sociology have often been encouraged and pushed to do things like marriage and family and things like that. In biology, does something like this happen, that women tend to get attracted or pushed in subtly towards some kind of biology?
Not in my experience, but I can't speak for everybody's experience.
Do we have more women in molecular biology and less women in molecular and more in developmental or evolutionary? Is there a pattern?
That I'm aware of, no.
You don't see that pattern?
I haven't noticed it.
You haven't noticed the pattern.
One pattern that I do think sort of supersedes all these other patterns, if they do exist, is that I think in every field of biology, somehow the hot topics or the most, what is considered the forefront, the exciting, somehow has an overrepresentation of men. In pretty much every subfield is how I feel it.
Yeah.
Now, how much of that is because there are more men in general in sciences at a level of faculty or above, or senior faculty, and how much of it is that they are more successful at promoting the work that they're doing as being the best and the cutting edge, whatever. I don't
I'm
know.
glad you say that. Yeah.
So I think that's something that sociologists should maybe tell me about.
Yeah. How they project, who gets to project.
And so, but for example, in biology, especially at this moment in time, there are a lot of people who came in from a physics background, and I have very rarely met in biology anybody who's a woman who was a physicist before and has come into biology. Again, I don't know what is the root of that. Of course, this is my experience. It may be not reflective of the bigger reality.
It's a matter of fact.
I have not noticed that. But I know several men who are now biologists and have come from a physics background or a mathematics background or training in those backgrounds. And they are often the ones who are doing a lot of very quantitative, heavy kind of biology. Which I guess comes from their training and their natural maybe interest in those kinds of data sets and asking those kinds of questions more. And I'm curious, I'm not aware of a study to address this, but I'm curious whether that has changed a certain subfield or a subfield to have a push towards being more, I guess the rating of what is considered top-notch biology in that area, has that changed as a result of the influx of people who come from that training and that background? Whether it is gendered, I don't know, because I don't have a comparison group in my observation. I don't know many female physicists or biologists.
Correct.
So I don't have that
That itself is a story that needs to be investigated and told, right? Deepa, you were speaking about how we need to work also on early education, whether at school level or at families, about how the disciplines get constructed. So I want you to delve a little bit on your own personal history. And what was it like growing up as a girl? And what was it as, how did the choice of doing science and a girl in science, how did that get shaped?
So I think my story is a nice one because it's extremely positive. So I have a brother, so I have a comparison, with not too different from me in age. And I think what was super lucky for me and for him, I think both of us, is that our parents were extremely encouraging of scholarship of any sort. And luckily we were both nerds and we loved reading, and and so really it was a win-win. Because what we really wanted to do and wanted to pursue was not at all in conflict with what our parents considered to be a good idea. And so my mother especially was extremely encouraging and supportive of, not supportive I would say she actively pushed me to say your career comes first. So I don't remember how old I was, but somewhere in middle school, high school, whatever. I remember her telling me several times, don't go chasing boys. It's all okay, do it at some point, but you must think of your career. You must have a career. You must be strong.
As if these two are in opposition.
Correct. Yeah. But that was very
is,
And of course, at that point, I had no idea what she was going on about because I thought boys were rather stupid. So whatever. So, but it stayed with me, and I think it made an impression for sure that you can pursue whatever you want to do. That message was extremely clear. So at a point where I think in high school, before I was maybe in 11th grade or something, I was fairly clear I wanted to do research. I loved chemistry at that point because there was a fantastic chemistry teacher in that school where I was. And I loved biology.
Was it a she or a he?
It was a she.
She,
And a very, very quiet.
Teachers are women. They don't get to do research. They teach anyway. Sorry. And interestingly, my biology teacher was not as inspiring. But I loved biology. And I loved genetics. Interesting.
So I had decided at that point that I wanted to do research in genetics, and I suspect a little bit of this had to do again with my mother as well. So my mother, when I was in middle school, I think, was doing a PhD in education. And her topic was, I think as part of her thesis, she was generating self-learning materials for students, and she chose biology as because I think her bachelor's degree was in biology. So my father was in the army and we were traveling around. And so I guess my mother then had to deal with moving a lot, and so she registered for her PhD when we were in Amritsar. So she was at the university there. Of course, that was too short a period to finish her PhD, so we moved at that point later in Gujarat, in Jamnagar, Gujarat. And so then I remember her going back to defend her thesis. And so I think, roughly in middle school, when we were in Jamnagar, so she had this self-learning material, lying around the house because she was making it. And I think she may have used me as a trial guinea pig.
I'm sure she did.
Because it wasn't too far from where I was in terms of school. The material was meant for high school children. And so I remember going through that, and so maybe that helped somewhere. I don't know. I imagine it did, because I then learned a bit about biology, and the way the questions were structured were meant to help you learn. So I suppose something percolated.
And that's how you chose to do biology. You did undergraduate in India?
I did undergraduate in India, yes, in biology. So around the time I finished my 12th class, like I said, I wanted to do research. I was very, very clear on this, and my parents didn't sort of suggest that I try engineering or try medical, which were the two common things that.
And your brother? What your brother?
So he's younger than me. He also ended up doing a PhD in kinesiology and neuroscience. He went to IIT Mumbai first, and then did a PhD in the subject, and then decided that he doesn't want to stay in academia. He works in a startup now.
So both of you chose to be
chose
in academia.
chose to do science.
Yeah, and in the academia.
In academia, yeah, but now he's not in academics anymore.
Okay.
But until his end of his PhD, he was. Right. So I think my mother found out. I guess she was asking people. At that point, my father was posted in Srinagar, where as families we couldn't go. Of course, it was a dangerous place to be, and so on. And of course, there were no colleges that would be easy to for me, work for me. So my mother and my brother and I went to Pune, where there were grandparents we could stay with, and so I was looking for a college in Pune, and my mother found out somehow that there was this one college in Pune called Garware College, where there's one professor who really encourages undergraduate research, and it was a microbiology department, and this professor was Vatve, Milind Vatve. And so they were starting a new program in industrial microbiology that year, where they would allow people to do research, and it would be a small batch of students.
In a college in Pune?
In a college in
Fantastic.
Pune. And so I gave the entrance test or whatever was required and got through, and that was amazing. That whole experience of being surrounded by people who love research, who love to learn, who, I found peers for the first time in my life that I could interact with, that I could bounce questions around with. We would discuss randomly all kinds of stuff. And then Vatve sir was great, because you go to him with a question. This was also the first place I encountered, apart from a few classes in high school, where asking questions was absolutely encouraged. It was never discouraged.
And this is a regular college in...
a regular college.
Amazing.
Nothing really fancy. This department was spectacular. And so we got to design our own experiments. We were given a set of experiments that we needed to finish, and we, were allowed to just form our own groups within the batch. And okay, you're going to learn about fermentation, and you're going to do a fermentation as part of this course. So, decide what you want to ferment and what you want to produce.
And so, in this setup also, you didn't see or detect any sort of I wouldn't use the word discrimination, but some sort of, girls would do this, boys would do that, you're better at this, none of this.
Nothing that was handed down to us, right? Some of this happened because we were girls and boys, to some extent, right? So, for example, in our group of, I think it was 7 of us who were doing experiments together. In our group, there were maybe 3 of us were girls and 4 boys, or the other way around, something like that. And as it turned out, many times us girls were the ones who were much more, on top of things. We were planning better, we were there, we were doing things, and the boys were goofing off a little bit more. But I don't think it was something that was externally enforced, or it was encouraged, or it happened to be so. I don't know if it would have happened with different group dynamics. If we were less on top of things, would the guys have done more? I don't know. But I certainly didn't get the impression that this was something that was a problem for me at that point. Or
it's confirmed that at that level, I mean, this of course is a very exceptional sort of situation, but at that level, girls are very, very committed. They do work hard. They work very hard, and not only do they work hard, but they are also extremely creative. Then what happens along the line is quite depressing, actually. And it's think about the stories of those girls. But I think also it's very interesting for me to observe that so many of us are telling the story of privilege, are telling the story of luck, are telling the story of fortune, and you do hear women who come from other kind of backgrounds, or people who come from other kinds of backgrounds, who don't get easy, or let's say naturally, socially permissible access. So I remember one interview, a conversation I had some years back with young Shalini Mathav, who was talking about being a Dalit girl, and she was amazing when she was talking about her story, and she was saying that there was so much enthusiasm in the family for her to actually do study, do science and all of that, but she said that entry and the experience of after entering into science was more disheartening because you never get over that, you're never made to get over the fact that you are from a certain category, you are of a social identity, and your voice is therefore not heard enough. This is an experience that we all need to factor in. If we want to talk about making science into a much more accessible space.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, because even women who make it into science come from similar privileges. No? I mean, I don't know what.
Many of us do. I know that many of us don't. I certainly have colleagues who are women
who don't.
Who don't. Their story is not as easy as mine, and not as lucky in many ways, for sure. So, but you know, all kinds of stories exist. Yes.
So you know, take us a little bit into your journey into getting into professional biology, PhD, postdoc. Did you go abroad? You did.
I did. I did go abroad for my PhD and my postdoc.
And how was the experience there, both in terms of gender and in terms of you being a brown woman, both ways?
Again, I don't have any really bad stories. I really enjoyed myself. It was just the most enriching part of my life. And both for my PhD and postdoc, I think I was, I guess, partly lucky, but also I chose well in hindsight. Places which were large universities in large cities in the US, and departments which were big departments of evolutionary biology, very well known as good departments, where a large number of international people, students came for studying. And that meant that, I didn't feel like I was the only outsider. Of course, I felt like an outsider for several reasons.
You did,
but I don't think that was only because I was, brown or non-American. I suspect that actually I know that many people, no matter how much, a third party may say, oh, but you belong. Many people in science feel that way, in graduate school, especially early days, right? And even at NCBS, with conversations that I've had with several students over the years, the students that sometimes I have felt or other faculty have felt are really just fantastic. These are the people who seem ready-made for an academic career, and yet if you ask the student what they think, that's not their perception or their thinking. So I think this feeling of being an outsider is kind of baked into the whole experience, partly because you're now suddenly surrounded by some of the smartest people you've ever met, right? And previously, of course, you were one of the smartest in your school or your college or whatever your experience was, but now you're not the only one. There are dozens of others around you. You are, if you're in a good department or a good institution, you are surrounded by people who are faculty at a very high level, of a very high caliber. And so...
and are there a lot of women there in the faculty? In biology, there might be a lot more.
Biology, yeah. I mean, certainly fewer than men.
Where were you in the US?
I was at the University of Texas in Austin, and then at Harvard University in Boston. And both places, there were fewer women than men.
Few women,
but it wasn't that there was one woman amongst 30.
30.
It was a much better ratio than that. And so
Did you work with any of the women mentors?
No. Both my mentors were men. So I didn't work with women particularly. And I should again say that I think I never experienced from my mentors certainly, but even others that I interacted in both places, other faculty, other departments, I didn't feel overt discrimination in any shape or form. I should say though that I tend to be a slow fuse. I tend to give a lot of leeway for people to say what they want to say or
we all try to
do what they do.
Yeah.
No, but I think several other people, perhaps because of their history of bad experiences in the past, have a very short fuse. They, they immediately see where something is wrong, and I think I fall short there a little bit sometimes.
Yeah.
It takes me a while. In hindsight, I will see that somebody said something that was not quite right.
Yeah.
And that was not acceptable. But it takes me a while to process usually. So it may be that because I didn't also respond to if somebody said something which was off color, it never escalated, and
we just sort of take it in our stride sometimes.
Yeah.
And then reflect on it and say.
Yeah. Sometimes. Yeah. But again, nothing really stands out as being something that would raise my hackles or I felt was really bad. I was not, in my view, treated differently than others.
What was it coming back? What was it like? You wanted to come back to India? What was the thinking?
So when I left India, it was not the thinking that we would come back. I should also say that my husband is also an evolutionary biologist, and we did our PhDs, postdocs together, and he's also a faculty here at NCBS. And so the decision to come back to India specifically was more driven by him than by me.
Okay.
So we were starting to apply for jobs. He was slightly ahead of me in the career stage, and he happened to visit NCBS while he was in India doing field work, and he said, "Oh, this place is amazing. I think we should consider seriously going back to this place." And until then, we had not very seriously considered India because when we left for our PhDs, there were very few evolutionary biologists in India, and so we knew that we would be isolated. There wasn't a big community, and I particularly felt that it was important for me to have a good community of people that I could interact with. I learn a lot in discussion. I learn a lot from having a diverse.
Right.
But his work is on Indian biodiversity, and so
Butterflies. Right?
Butterflies.
Yes.
So it was important for him to, if possible, to be in India. And so once I visited NCBS, I was convinced that yes, I think this is a good place. And I think around that same time, a number of other people also working in evolutionary ecology were coming back to India and thinking about joining, set up labs here. So then it seemed like, okay, the community is going to grow. And my own work was such that it could be done anywhere in the world. It was not centered around a region or a location. The other thing, as we thought about this more, a feature that became attractive to me about coming back to India is to set up something that didn't exist very much here. So in particular, molecular evolution, even now there are very, very few people in India who work in molecular evolution. And so to both of us, it felt like a good opportunity to come and contribute in more meaningful ways to building a community here than what we would be able to do anywhere in the Western world, for example, where we would be one amongst hundreds of people doing work in evolution. So
the two-body problem got sorted.
Two-body problem also. So we didn't face that problem really ever. Ever actually. We were able to move together throughout our careers, but it certainly is a problem that many people face. And so I think this worked out, and
this is something, a lot of women in science are beginning to talk about it, the two-body problem, and also, crashes and flexible timings and all of that. So I'll now sort of, you were talking about mentoring and the fact that you were mentored by men, and now you have a whole lab. You're mentoring people here. One of the things that we get to hear is that women PIs or women scientists, whether they are physicists or biologists or chemists or whatever, they become much more aggressive and toxic in their ways of being, and therefore, in our language, more masculine. And often when people talk about this, they blame the women and say, "Oh, look at them, they're doing the same thing," and we're like, why are they doing the same thing? It's because of the way they're expected, the way the culture of science is organized. You have to become much more assertive, much more aggressive, cutthroat, competitive, all of that. It defines Would you sort of, how do you respond to this? I mean, other than saying that, yeah, it's people and personalities, it's also about a question of, the demands of women in science to be in a particular way. In order to succeed?
Yeah, to some extent, yes, I think so. I think there is a certain way that, academia, or especially in very competitive environments or competitive institutions, perhaps there's some expectation that you have to do such and such things, you have to achieve such and such things, and
survival of the fittest.
Survival of the fittest. I mean, it's not really quite that, yeah. But yeah, I mean, it's not a zero-sum game, and I think the sooner we all realize it, the better off we'll be. But maybe there's some truth to that, right? That yeah, I think we do need to think of who sets the expectations for how we should be, and what is top-notch science, what is top-notch mentorship.
Absolutely.
There needs to be a conversation and thinking about it, absolutely. But I feel that pressure is, I think it might simply be a case that there is a smaller sample size for women, right? And so if a certain proportion of both men and women are going to react to pressure in a certain way by being difficult to work with, or in ways that makes them difficult to work with, I think the women are somehow much more of an eyesore.
Yeah.
And we tend to remember them perhaps much more than we remember the men who are toxic, because there's many other men who are also not toxic.
And that's I understand that there are men who are not toxic, but if men are toxic, it's acceptable to some extent.
I agree with that. I think it is accepted much more easily, and this is something that comes from students as well. How students or your peers expect you to be when you are a female versus a male scientist is a bit different. How administration staff expect you to behave if you're a man or a woman is a little bit different. Now, nobody's going to tell you this explicitly. Nobody tells you to your face that I expect you to do that. But it's all these other cues. I have another hypothesis, which is that I think perhaps on average women are more sensitive to all these cues that we get from other people compared to men. And that may also make us
brought up like that. To be watching people, picking up signals, becoming more sensitive to things around us. We pick up much faster.
So I don't know how much, these are all complicated questions.
Yeah, these are all deeply complicated because we carry our gender identities within us. It's not something that is only imposed on us, and that sort of comes in the way we perform. Also, Deepa, very often people say, the paradigm of explanation for the low representation of women in science for a very long time, even from women in science, was that it's because of their double social responsibilities of being homemakers, caregivers, plus being professionals. So it's a dual role responsibility. But then we also observe that a lot of women who are not married, who are not committed to care work and things that don't have those social responsibilities, also don't get to be very successful in science. So in that sense, it sort of also indicates to us that this is not the only problem. The problem also exists within the way women are looked at in science, irrespective of whether they are married, not married, have children, don't have children. There is a certain way in which they are marginalized. This is something. So for example, you look at the awards. Many of our awards that we are talking about, women started getting it so much later. Whether it's your, I don't know the statistics, but the Bhatnagar Awards, the Swarna Jayanti Awards, all the awards that we can talk about, the percentage of women getting it is much less. And so I think those are the kind of questions also that I feel very optimistic, because I think women in science themselves have started asking these questions. 20 years back, they were not.
I'll just add to that.
Yes, please.
I think one other factor that also influences, especially things like awards or recognition of any sort, is the networking, right? And the advocating.
Absolutely.
And I think in general, women tend to not be very good, not be advocated for as much. Perhaps because they're either not inherently good at networking or are encouraged to network or are included in the beginnings of networks. And so, often there may not be anybody who's saying, hey, this person deserves this recognition, they're really good.
And so the onus again falls on the woman. You have to project yourself.
Yeah.
But the question that we ask is this network and projection the only way in which recognition should be given?
Certainly not, but I think at least what I've observed in India is that...
And we keep pushing women to become like that. You must, if you want to get the awards, want to succeed, you must become like that. But the question should be asked differently, whether it is that's the way to get these rewards, and whether these rewards and awards mean anything at all.
Yeah. No, I agree absolutely. The only problem is that, we are operating, at least in the last 20, 30 years, I think, in a situation where there are a lot of scientists, and nobody knows, all the scientists in their area, working even in a country, right? And so it's impossible for anybody to do an honest search as a committee, for example, and hunt out work that is worthy of whatever, or recognition or commendation. So how do you go about, rewarding excellent work? And in the day of social media, a lot of it has to do with who is loudest on social media. But it does have to do with advocacy, and it has always been the case. Now, whether this is, the right way to go about it, no, clearly. But what is the alternative? It's not very obvious to me.
So one of the things that we've been sort of talking about also is this whole award to the individual, which sort of amplifies, magnifies the individual over the collective, over the collaborative work. And probably one of the ways to get out of it is to not have these individual rewards and awards. Have groups and collectives and organizations being validated through funding, because awards eventually are about funding and ranking and things like that. So, why put so much pressure on the individual? And it's often one kind of individual who, it's very, very privileged, who keeps getting this. I'm amused at the number, and not just in the sciences. The same person keeps getting multiple awards.
It's easy for selection committee to say, oh, you've already gotten 5, let's give you another one.
Wondering why they don't say no to it, there are others around me who are equally good. Anyway, so the other thing I wanted to, talk to you about is this other model of mentoring that we women tend to either be pushed towards or adopt ourselves, but now I notice women have started resisting it, which is this model of mothering. Either you're expected to mother and be kind and be this and be that just because you're a woman, not because that is a good way to do science, that's a good way to work with people, but because you're a woman you should do it. How do you respond to this?
So again, I have not felt that pressure overtly.
To be more caring.
That happens to come naturally to me, and I have always thought that that's a good way to be. And I also felt that both my mentors, in very different ways, were the caring sort of people. They expressed it to different degrees and so on. But so I guess what I'm saying is, it felt to me that sometimes the students' expectations were different of me and of my male colleagues. But of course I have relatively less information about what's going on in other labs, right? Sometimes when we talk.
No, I see the difficulty that you are facing in maybe, speaking about this, but would you consider the fact that, it's sort of expected that we should be more caring and things like that, and it is not expected of the men to do that necessarily.
In general, I think yes, from students there is this expectation.
And we internalize also that, students internalize that, and that becomes another kind of a burden. No?
It is, and so I think one of the good things that has happened, at least with me, as I've grown a little bit older in my career and my age, is that I have changed, or have thought more carefully about how I want to be as a mentor.
I remember you telling me.
Where is that coming from exactly? How much of it is what I truly feel is important in a mentor, and how much of it is what I may have perceived as being something that others are expecting me to do, and like you said, internalize it enough that it feels as if it's my own, and it may not. Also, with experience of mentoring, you learn, especially if you think about it enough, you can see what actually worked and what wasn't particularly helpful in any case, and then you discard those things, right? And I think at the moment what I've settled on is that there are boundaries beyond which I will not be extra caring or whatever, and then there are every person in my lab needs a different style of mentoring, because they are all different sets of people with different backgrounds, different experiences, expertise, whatever. And so I think I also started off mentoring with this idea that I have to be giving equal attention to everybody in my laboratory. That, in hindsight, was not a great idea, not very useful. And so over the years, I've discarded that idea. And that is one important place, I think, where the realization that nobody else has a say in what is to be expected of me as a mentor, except me and my students, right? And therefore, when I clearly see that different students require different amounts of time and effort from me at different points of time in their careers, as they grow and develop as scientists, that's what I need to do. It is not only more efficient, but it is also much more productive and useful, and it puts less burden on me then. I can mentor more people more effectively if I'm able to spread out, my effort.
Boundaries and your...
And not that anybody was telling me how I should be doing things, right? But somewhere I had this idea that I have to do things a certain way. And
one
again,
learns.
In hindsight, I'm like, okay, well, I don't know why I thought that, but it goes out the window. And now I'm at the position where if somebody comes and says, you're doing a bad job of mentoring, I will politely tell them to leave, because I know I'm not. And this is something I've thought about enough. And I'm happy to get other ideas about, which I get, of course. I have colleagues that I speak with often, and one learns different tips and tricks. But that is different. If somebody's coming and lecturing me about this, I am not willing to listen anymore.
Does that happen? Do people come and lecture?
Not anymore.
No, but when you were younger.
I think when we were, as early faculty, once in a while, sometimes people get this idea that we need to be mentored.
We need to be mentored on how to mentor.
How to be. I'm not saying that's necessarily a bad idea, but then you have to choose carefully. And just like, different students need different degrees and kind of mentoring, different faculty need different degrees and kind of mentoring. And if you don't tailor your faculty mentoring programs to what the faculty actually need, then it's just going to cause annoyance and it's going to be counterproductive.
Yeah, because it's again a very standard thing that is given. But so on this question of mentoring, one can, talk a lot. But what I'm finding is that when we talk about women's lives and what we have to learn from them and what we need to bring into our professional spaces, the question of care, the question of compassion, sensitivity or humanness is not to be applicable only to women, no? That's what we're basically saying, that those values need to be adopted by every scientist, whether they are male, female, non-binary, whoever they are, right? And much more, because if we want to open up science to people coming from marginal groups, you need a lot more of sensitivity and compassion and care. And it can't be just the burden of women in that sense.
No, but I feel also in a place like NCBS where individual PIs really drive the work that they do, and whatever happens in the lab, it's really a full kind of a closed unit, I would say. So there is, of course, some cross-mentoring.
Thank God we didn't call it a family. Because sorry.
I mean, there is, of course, some cross-mentoring happening, no question about it. And people do watch out for, other students as well, even if they're not our own students. But yeah, I think a lot comes down to when we hire colleagues, the idea that this is a person who really cares about doing science well, but also with the cognition that there are 30,000 ways of doing a good job, no matter what profession you're in. And so I think having prescriptive ideas about what a good mentor is like is also something that I find very, very difficult to swallow. Yeah, extremely bit. No matter what the gender is. Right? Even this idea that, you know, in general we should be compassionate and sensitive and so on. I fear being prescriptive about that either, because, you know, as PIs we are also humans who are all sorts of personalities. You know, some of us are shy, some of us are socially anxious, some of us are not particularly great at communicating, but we are all good scientists. And so if the core idea is that the students are here to learn how to do good science, then the personality of the mentor should be a match to the students, yes, but it cannot be the focus of our measure as scientists. It can be one aspect of our measure as mentors, but I think these two things should not be conflated too much. They cross-talk with each other, yes. To a certain degree, being a good mentor is helpful.
So you don't
for good
think that
science.
a good researcher necessarily is a good mentor or vice versa?
No, I don't think so. And I don't think it needs to be the case, right? Because you can be a good scientist but not be in a position of being a mentor and do excellent science, right? And I think that's all right. Because not all of us are born with mentoring skills or want to learn mentoring skills or want to be mentoring.
Actually, I'm using mentoring also to mean not just the actual way of getting students to do science and become successful in science. I mean mentoring also in terms of developing human connections between you and your students. You know, all said and done, the PIs are human beings, but they are also human beings in position of power as opposed to those who are just entering in. So to be able to understand how to handle power, to be able to understand how to develop an equation and compassion with your students is a human act. So we just call it mentoring, but mentoring frankly often means, oh, you know, you go for this conference, do this, do that. But I think what I was probably trying to indicate is something else. You know, to be able to build solid human connections with your, because you know we are all human beings at some level. You know?
No, I agree with you. I see what you're saying, but I think there's so as an extreme case, one can take abusive mentorship, right? That's clearly something that's a bad idea, right? Because that's where you're failing in your basic human interaction. But I think there's a big gap between abuse as a mentor, psychological, verbal, whatever it is,
and drawing boundaries,
and not being a great mentor in the full sense of the word.
No, that I understand.
You could be helping the student's career, etc., without necessarily forming bonds with them or forming deep connections with them, but be a good mentor in the sense of teaching this person how to do good science, right? How to project yourself perhaps as a...
But these are long relationships.
I know,
4 years and 5 years
I agree.
and 6 years. And if the human connection doesn't get established, I find that at a later stage, the relationship might risk being collapsed into a very, very, you know...
But that's a choice that those people have to make.
To make how they do.
Yeah, and I truly feel that, like I said, there are all kinds of people who are mentors and students. You know, there are some students, for example, who are not the kind who will form deep bonds. But that doesn't mean they cannot be.
It's the way.
Right?
I absolutely agree with you. I in fact have been feeling, and which is something I want to also talk about, is that how a scientific institution, the atmosphere is very different from, say, a university, you know, where there is much more ease, there's much more warmth, there's much more connection. Anyway, that's a different... I wanted to also, you know, you were talking about abusive mentors, and I had a question here on sexual harassment. Now, on sexual harassment, there's been a huge silence in most of our institutions, but scientific research institutions particularly. And this came out a lot in the #MeToo movement also. So what do you think? Are scientific institutions so pristine and so pure that there is no sexual harassment at all? Or do you recognize that there is? It might not have happened to us, you know, but the point is we know about it, that it exists. Then what is your understanding of this?
Yes, as you said, of course there is harassment.
No. We can't deny that anymore.
No. Clearly there is.
We can't.
What is the magnitude of it? What is the frequency?
We won't know that unless we actually do the research.
Yeah.
And you know that research itself is such a closed area. Yeah. And even the ICs, which are institutional mechanisms set up to keep a track, are hardly functioning. And it's not, again, this is not true of scientific institutions. It's not functioning in most places. But do you think that women's collectives or or a group of dedicated scientists, it could be women or men, who should look at this, what is going on?
Absolutely. I think it is worthy of study for no reason other than to understand what is going on.
Because students do talk about it everywhere, you know, and I don't know, faculty, but student, faculty, it's so present, and yet it's something we don't want to discuss.
Yep.
Because we just have blinkers. It doesn't exist in scientific institutions. So if there are no reports means it doesn't exist.
I don't know. I actually also feel that we don't even know if there are no reports, right? Those of us who are not on the ICCs or the committees have no idea what's going on.
No idea.
And so
maybe we should think about this.
Yeah. No, I think we do. And I again feel like it needs to start at a relatively earlier career stage where it needs to be made easier for people to report harassment.
Yeah, absolutely.
The mechanisms have to be clear, transparent, open, and protection has to be provided and guaranteed.
Absolutely.
I know there are measures, you know, in terms of guidelines and rules from the government for these committees, but I don't know much beyond that.
They are not functioning. You know, another question seems like a superficial one, but it's an important one. Is it, I feel that in academics in general, but in science particularly, there is a certain way in which women are expected to perform their identity as women. They are expected to dress in a particular way. We all find our own space. But is this structurally implicitly or explicitly present, how women are supposed to dress, how they're supposed to talk, how they're supposed to talk in meetings and conferences, seminars, how they're supposed to sit, how they're supposed to conduct themselves? So one hears of younger people saying, if I wear too much of this kind of I will not be taken seriously. Maybe it doesn't happen at a later stage in the career, but do you think this exists for girls?
Certainly, to some extent. I would say more so perhaps in India than what I've observed abroad. But in explicit ways, not so much that I've observed. Implicitly, again, we're humans and we have our weird, societal norms.
And there's extra pressure on the women, no? To keep in mind all the time, if I dress like this, I'll be perceived like that. If I'm dressed like,
I guess, but at least in India, I don't know how much of that is coming from our society broadly, and how much of it is specific to academia. In fact,
but academia is a part of society.
No, I know, but that's what I'm saying. So because it's a part of society, whatever is our societal norms about how women should dress versus men should dress, what is perceived as being okay, too revealing, too sedate, too flashy, too whatever. I think some of that is going to percolate in the scientific institutions that we operate in. But what I'm trying to say is that I can't differentiate those two things necessarily. At least in our campus, I feel like it is not explicit for sure, and even the implicit expectation is pretty much not there. But it is an issue that one does confront at some point or the other in any career, I would imagine. But for example, I have had certain cases where I wondered whether I should tell somebody in my lab that their dress sense is perhaps inappropriate for the experiments that they're doing, because they might hurt themselves because they're wearing very few clothes. I was worried about this person on the street as they walked to campus, and I don't want to tell them, I don't want to police them. I never said anything, and yet I worried for this person.
That's exactly what I'm saying.
And I don't know what to do about it.
If we develop a human relationship with them, there will come a point where we can probably tell them as equals, and by sharing one's own process, often learning from them. How do they get that confidence? I'm amazed. And how have we navigated it? So when I was also saying about mentoring or human, it was also a way of having these conversations, which otherwise we don't know how to do it, because we are in a position of power, and anything you say will be considered to be moral policing or will be considered to be authoritarian. It's only when we make that non-hierarchical space that we can actually open up this conversation.
But the certain kinds of conversations, I'm not sure, even with a flat hierarchy, I'm not sure I wanted to have it. Not because it was uncomfortable, because I wasn't sure if I was right or wrong.
Exactly.
And so
That's
I don't know.
I
still don't know what is the right approach in this situation.
That's a very honest thing to say. That's a very honest thing to say, that I don't know whether what I'm thinking is right or wrong. I know. So there are two last things. One is that in feminist science studies, the broad stroke, I'm saying, I'm not talking about feminist biology and its way of re-understanding natural sex selection, and there's a lot of work there that is happening. But on a broader stroke also, when we look at what modern Western science has done to the society and to the world, is we see both things. We see immense benefit and contribution, and also we see immense destruction and the risk that modern Western science has caused. And as a biologist working in the field that you're working in, how do you see where science should be going? Which sort of direction? Because we've destructed a lot, and while genetics is very, very crucial as a direction for biology, do you feel that it would also have its own risks in society?
Absolutely.
And how do we look at that?
These are difficult questions.
I'm sorry, I just say, how do you think scientists, what is their role?
What is our role? I think our role is, apart from doing the science that we're doing, to be extremely open and honest about the risks, and it is also our job to at least think of the risks, right? And communicate it, absolutely, and be clear about them when we see them, not hide them, and also invite other aspects of.
We do tend to hide them, but don't we? Well, most
depends, I guess,
No.
So, and recognize that whatever you do or whatever you put out as a statement, as your findings, can be misused by people who may wish to use that information in aid of their own agenda. The famous example being of eugenics, a century ago or so, where the idea that there is a hereditary component of who we are as humans, led to really bad policies, discrimination of all sorts and so on. And so, and some of the best thinkers in the field at that point were seemingly either not realizing the dangers of what they were showing, how that could be used, or in some cases were actively participating in the eugenics movements that were ongoing locally. So it seems like we've had lots of warning cases like this where our findings can be misused.
Sometime back, sorry to cut you, but sometime back I think you had also talked about racial stereotyping and what maybe countries and governments and across the world want to do with getting DNA and genetic mappings of on the axis of race. And I think you took a position which maybe you can just talk about in terms of how modern biology has looked at race and how that has changed.
So, many decades ago, some of the earliest data on human genetics very clearly showed that most of the variability that we have in our DNA inherently is segregating at the level of individuals. So you and I are much more different from each other than me versus any other random racial ethnic group that we can think of. And so the problem here is that what we call a race is defined based on a lot of cultural, a lot of
absolutely
phenotypic features and so on and so forth. And the problem is that there has been so much migration in humans across the millennia, and we are a very, very new species, and we all come from this original tiny population in Africa, and that was so recent that much of the variation that we observe in us, you can't pin it down to a small number of genes and so on, right? And people seem to insist that they should be able to do that. So is the study of human genes or genetics a bad idea or a bad scientific question? Absolutely not. It should be done to better understand us. It has enormous implications for human diseases, understanding their origin and finding cures and so on. But if the way the question is being posed is to have an agenda about what is race X, what is race Y, and perhaps a hidden motivation to find which one is superior, or which one is older and therefore has bigger claims to a certain piece of land, whatever the agendas might be, then I think we are in danger, and that's a problem.
And that's where scientists probably can come in and provide some correctives.
Yes. So actually there's some debate going on right now in the scientific community on social media, where there is a large data set of genome data set on human genomes that has been put together, and they published a paper about it. And some of the way the statistics were done and represented are being criticized by population geneticists, human population geneticists, pointing out that the way the data were represented tends to exaggerate the differences across so-called racial groups. And so when you then show that plot, and that plot is then being
extrapolated.
And use it in public settings, because the people who are seeing it don't understand the statistics or the issues with the statistics or those kinds of plots, they will take away this idea that, oh, there's one group of race A and one group of race B that clearly are distinct in this plot, which is not the case. The plot is meant to highlight those differences and find ways of plotting the data so that you see those differences to be starker. And so this is the kind of public debate that needs to be had and very clearly in the public sphere, because the stakes are too high.
Absolutely. Lastly, this is if you were given total freedom and no responsibilities of any kind, gender or otherwise, to pursue science single-mindedly and in one direction, would you choose that? Would that be your way of happiness?
Oh, absolutely, yes. I would say I'm not too far from that at the moment. It's not that I have great burdens in my mind that are preventing me from doing that. I am in a supremely lucky position here, and much of what I do is in service of the science that I want to do. There is some stuff here and there which I would be happily rid of.
What about poetry?
Oh, but
or art or literature or cinema.
I would do all those, but I'm free to pursue my science, right? That's what I really want to do most of my time. And then the rest of the time, yes, I will read poetry, I will write poetry, I will love to learn languages, I will love to learn crafts and so on. But